Welcome, guys. Welcome to Encoding Science. And today we'll take a look at what the variable is. It's going to be a short video and try to understand what a variable is and how it's going to work. So let's get started. Before we start taking a look at the variable, let's think a little bit. So what is a program? What do we do with a program? Well, what we do is we take information, may it be a number, a text, or whatever. We take information, then we do something with it, and we give it back. So how can we, once we give the information at the start of the program, how can we keep it somewhere and then handle it? Well, that's where the variable comes in place. Okay, so the variable is the most basic way of storing information, and that gives us the possibility to do stuff with it. So I think it's a perfect way to represent a variable with a box. So I wanted to start by just drawing a box and pick a color. So we make a nice box here. That is our variable. And that variable will have a name that we pick. And I'm gonna be very boring here. I will call it X. So we have a place where we're going to keep information on our RAM, and we'll be calling it X, which means that when we're programming, we'll use the X to call our variable. And it will have a type. And the type here, I'm going to decide that it's going to be an integer. So we're going to use the short for int. And when you work with variables, there are different types, and we'll see a little bit better. We'll talk a little bit later on types, but you could have something like a string, which is a text, or you could have, if you like to work with more numbers, you could have a double, that is more precise, bigger numbers. You can have larger numbers or more precise numbers. You can have floats. You have Boolean. For those that don't know, it's a 0 or a 1 that gives either a true, false for 0 and true for 1. And we'll make a video on Booleans later. But what is important to know is when you make a variable, you need to decide on a type. Okay. So when we make a program, we start, let's make it like we make a program here. So that is the program start. Okay. So this is kind of a pseudocode. I'm not going to follow worry too much about the syntax, but it's just to give you an idea. So we have a program start, and at the beginning of our program, we're going to initiate our variable. So what usually you do, you declare what kind of type it will be. Then you will be assigning a name. So here we call it X. You could call it whatever you want. Most program will make the difference between a small programming language will make the difference between a small X or a big X. So you need to be careful with what you're writing. If you're writing a small X here, you need to use a small X later. So that's important. So you could just do this and start the variable, then you would finish like that. Okay, we'll make this to represent a semicolon to represent the end of the line. Not every language is using a semicolon, but here we'll just use it to represent the end of the line, that we finish with this line of code. So what happens if you do this? Well, if you do this, you created a place on your RAM that is assigned to hold an integer, and it's called X. Now, X is a pointer, which means that it will actually be representing an address in your RAM, but you don't need to worry much about that. It's just good to know. Now, you could also, so that's possible to just do this and you make an empty variable. So there is no value in it. Otherwise, you could also start it with a value. So if you started with int x equal something, like say 0. Now you started your variable with the value 0 in it. And I just want to point out that it's important to make the difference between a 0 and a null, because it's not the same. Huh? When it's null, it's empty, there is nothing in it. But here, there is something in it. It's the value 0, it's the number 0. So that's the difference. Okay, so we created a variable here. So we have our box with the name, and we can do stuff like, for example, we could later on say x is equal to 5. There we go. So what happens then? So we start a variable at 0, and then we go to the next line and we change the value, and here it becomes not 0, but it becomes 5. There we go. Simple. I want to point out that here you don't need to put the type anymore, because you already created, you initialized the variable on top, and you do it just once in your program, okay? So you don't need to do it again. Here you just call the variable, you just say at this address I want to store the value 5. Okay. So and you could keep doing this. So why do we like to do this? Well, let's say you wanted to do the operation, for example, 5 plus 2. So now you can write this in your program. For example, in Python, you could do that and it will give you back the value 7. And that's cool. But the problem is that if you would, let's say you would make a program and make calculations, and then suddenly x value changes, then suddenly the 5 here, you need to go in your program and change the number 5 manually. And that's just not reasonable to program something like that. So by using the variable, what you can do is like you can make an entry, like a user entry. You could make a user entry. No, sorry. You can make, for example, say that in X, you will put user entry. So now there are different ways of doing this, depending on the language. But pretty much it means that your user, when coming into the line, your user will receive in its command, in its terminal, the possibility to write something and then put it in X. So if the user would choose to put 2, for example, then suddenly in your variable here, you would have 2. And then in the next line, you could do X plus 2. And that would return here the value 4. See, so that gives you flexibility. Now suddenly you have a space in your program where a user can enter the value he wants and do the operation with the value that he wants. So that's the idea of a variable. Now there are a few things to be careful about. So I wanted to talk about first the problem with the importance with the type. Let's see, because if let's say we created another variable, but this one, it will be another type. So let's change color. We'll go for something like blue. Okay. So now we want to create a string. Okay. This is not an integer anymore. It's going to be a string and we'll call it y. Okay. And inside we'll store the value 3 here. That's right. So we can go and create our another box here. Whoop. There we go. The name of the box is y, and this one is of type string. Okay. So now let's say, let's go back. We'll try another color to make it looks a little bit better. So now we started our program. We go to this. We create our x with 0 value. So here now it's 0, not 2, because we started at 0. And we have a 3 here in our container. And you see here there are quotes. That's to say this is a string. It's a string, a text, not a integer. Okay, because if you put directly 3 without the quotes, that means you're trying to put an integer in it, but we don't want to do that. And you will see in a second why. So let's say you want to do x plus y. What would be the result of that? Well, in this instance, you would receive an error. Okay, you would get an error. Why is that? Well, what you're actually trying to do here is to make an operation, an addition with an integer, so 0 plus a string. But the string is not a number here, it is a text. So you're trying to make an addition between a number and a text, and that is just not possible. Now, you could do something like this. So if you, let's say this one will give you an error, you remove it. So you remove it. Whoops. Sorry, I'm not that good at drawing on the computer. And instead you would say, for example, x plus y. And let's imagine a function that is transforming this. Sorry, I am transforming this into a string. I need to transform this into an integer. Int. Okay, so this is a function that converts the string into an integer. So now you have two correct types. You're trying to do an addition between the integer 0 in x plus the integer 3, because we transform the text into an integer. Now this here is a function that some of you might recognize from a certain language. I'm just using it to give it an example. It is not, this is just the idea. This can change depending on the language you're using. Some language will do this automatically, some others will not. So it's just important to understand that there is a conflict of type here. And you need to resolve it. If you get errors, depending on your language, you need to resolve this. It's not automatically complicated, but it's important to know. So then you would get your result here, that is like 0 plus 3, you would get your result 3. It's perfect. So that's one of the challenges and something that you need to be aware of. Now the second thing is that the variable, when you call it, depending on where you call it in your program, it may not become accessible anymore. So let me give you an example. So remove all of this, and you started a program, you start doing some some stuff here, like that, and suddenly you decide you want to do something like a loop. So let's make this is a for loop. Okay, we're making a for loop that will happens 5 times. Let's say 5 times. Okay, that happens 5 times. I'm just making this in parentheses. So you get your program here that's happening, and then you go into your for loop. Okay, and inside your for loop, you decide that you need a variable. You need something to maybe count the numbers of turns. Or actually, this would fit more if it was a while, just for the purpose. So let's make it a while loop. So a while. So you decide to make an integer, like let's use x. Okay, starts at 0, and while the loop is, for example, while the loop is well, that's maybe not the best example, but let's say that you have a while loop and you have an integer x in 0 here. Okay, so you started a value, and then you end your loop. Okay, so you can use your x in here. You can change the value. So let's say you can say x equal 3 here. Perfect. That becomes a 3 here. And then you end your loop. You come out here. Now here you're trying to say x is equal to 5, but you get an error. Why is that? Well, you created your integer inside the loop, okay, not outside. So when you're trying to call it from outside the loop, it doesn't exist anymore, or it's not available anymore. So to avoid this, what you should do is instead you create your integer here. If it's a variable that you will need outside the loop, I mean, sometimes you create something that you don't need it outside the loop, you just need it inside, so that's no problem. But if you later on need to be able to call it, well, you need to create it outside the loop. Don't need automatically to be completely on top, but it needs at least to be outside. It's to scope, So it's called the scope, and it needs to be the correct place. So that's important to know. Then suddenly here, yes, you can access it and it becomes 5. But otherwise, so you need to be careful where you call in your variables. This is something you can, we're working only on the concept here, so I'm not making any program. This is something you will go in more details also when we're doing this in different languages, in Python and Java and all, but that's pretty much the same concept in every languages. So, and then you do your stuff here and you end program. Okay. So that's pretty much it. I think it's the base concept of the variable. That's how it works. And it's important because it's the main element that we're using a lot. So there is different different structures of how to keep information, but they're all really based around the variable. Because if you create an object of your own that has specific structure and everything, what it contains is pretty much variables. If you take an array, it's a collection of variables. If you take a list, it's a collection of objects containing variables. So variables is the first block to learn, so later on you can make more complicated things. So the variable is really important. So that's it for today. Short video about variables. I hope you liked it, and if you want to learn more, please keep following. I will come with more videos on programming. Hope to see you.